1 Edward 1029, copy, threatening traffic.
Copy, moving route.
Edward 1029, if you could please respond to 2020 McNeil Street, Lakeview.
Copy. If you still have roll on, get the ATO information first.
Welcome to Shooting Straight with Brad and Casey. I'm Brad Carlyon, your Navajo County attorney, and my partner in this is
Casey Clark, Navajo County Sheriff.
Thank you for joining us again this month. And we have a guest from the Forest Service. We have Jeremy Human, who's, what are you in charge of, Jeremy?
I'm the forest fuel specialist.
What does that mean in English?
Okay, so that would equate to, I'm one of the 3 chiefs assigned to the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest. I work out of Springerville.
A chief in what sense? Like a fire chief?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so you're in, well, your hat says fire, U.S. Forest Service Fire. So what are your responsibilities then as the chief?
Okay, so I manage the day-to-day operations of the fuels program. So prescribed fire, things like that. That's kind of my program to manage overall big picture forest view of that. And then I'm heavily involved in operations as well. So on a given day, I can be the forest duty officer over the prescribed burns, things like that. So
when you talk about fuels, you're talking fuels that are laying on the ground plus the trees or the combination of the whole?
Well, I collaborate heavily with the timber group, the 4-fry group, the mechanical side of the house, so to speak, as far as how we treat the standing timber, the things that bring economy to the counties, things like that. So I collaborate with those folks, but my main responsibility is the prescribed fire, the hazardous fuels reduction around the towns. And
so how do you decide where to do these prescribed burns?
Oh, that's a complex question. So several different factors. That comes from the districts, from the land managers that are on the ground. They prioritize events, but obviously we put a heavy emphasis around wildland-urban interface, but we also put a total restoration picture on that. So, if you have a big fire in the back 40, you can have the best treatments in the world around the WUI, but if it's just a small treatment in some larger fires such as the Rodeo Chetaskai, the Wallow Fire, things like that, come roaring out of the back 40, we have to do some work there. So not only do we want to protect those watersheds, but we want to reduce the hazards there as well so the fires don't get to an unhealthy intensity or such a severity that they can kind of come roaring into town.
So what exactly is a prescribed burn? We see the smoke, we see the sign saying don't report it, but how do you do a prescribed burn and how do you control it? Okay,
so big planning process ahead of time, obviously, and so the fire managers on the ground, they evaluate the area, they put together what we call a prescription. So they evaluate the weather parameters that we're not only going to meet resource objectives, so maybe we want to reduce the logs and the pine needles on the ground, but we also want to regenerate buckbrush for wildlife habitat, for example. You're seeing a lot of that work this winter in the Rodeo Chetaskai fire scar. The Lakeside and Black Mesa districts both have been doing those kinds of projects, and so we identify the parameters where we feel like we can implement it safely but still meet our objectives of the burn plan. This goes through the NEPA process just like anything else we do, so it's open to public comment. And then we evaluate those comments, see if we need to change our objectives, what alternative we pick, so on and so forth. But when we get to the meat and potatoes of it, we look for those weather parameters, right, that we talked about that are going to be within the plan, meet our objectives. That's when you start to see news releases, the electronic signboards out on the roads, and the same guys that fight fire, same guys and gals that fight fire all summer are the same ones that are lighting it. It's, management ignited ignition, and we choose the time and the place. We do a test burn before we start implementation every day. So even if we burned it 7 days in a row and things have been going well, on day 7 we still do a test burn in the morning in an area where we can control it, can be contained, make sure we're still seeing the same objectives, same type of fire behavior, and then we make a go, no-go decision on whether or not we're going to continue. So each project has a burn boss and then various overhead assigned underneath that.
You know, I went through the Phoenix fire. It was I think Monday or Tuesday after it was pretty well out.
Okay.
And there was, I forget, it was a Forest Service gentleman there. And as I looked at that area burnt, I was like, this is actually a good fire, because it was cleaning up a lot of that old rodeo Chetasky logs on the ground and so forth. And when I talked to the fire boss there, he said, yeah, he says, except for the winds came up, and he said, that's the reason we had to get this thing out.
Right.
But that was really, I think, good for that area, trying to clean some of that up. It wasn't going to go anywhere really, except maybe into some other cedars.
Right. So by policy, anything that is started by a human, we have to suppress it. Even if it's doing good on the ground, we got to put it out for obvious reasons. If we started allowing man-caused ignitions to go, then that would give some folks some different ideas on becoming lightning. So now naturally ignited fires such as lightning, then we can use them to manage the landscape. For instance, the turkey fire over 4th of July weekend on the Lakeside Ranger District last year, lightning started fire, did a lot of good. It's very cost effective for us to use those fires in that way. It helps protect the communities. And so the Phoenix fire, regardless of how great it looks or didn't look, we would have to suppress that regardless.
You talked about having to go through the NEPA process before starting the prescribed fires.
Correct.
Where can a viewer find out a listing of where you're thinking of starting prescribed fires in the future?
Okay.
And how long does this process take?
And what does NEPA stand for?
All right, thank you. Yeah, I talk in acronyms a lot. So NEPA stands for National Environmental Protection Act. So it's a law that Congress passed back in the day, but basically it's an environmental document where we look at the greater good, what the objectives are, provide several alternatives to the public, and then based on best science, history of what we've seen in the area, things like that, the forest supervisor or the deciding official, sometimes the district ranger, depending on the size of the decision, will go ahead and pick one of those alternatives. So as far as, to get to your question, Brad, as far as where they look, we have a link on our webpage. You just go to the public side of the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest. You can see all the projects that are under consideration. We do we have mailing lists that you can get on. So if you're particularly interested in, let's say, the Black Mesa Ranger District, you want to know all the things going on in that area, you can petition that Ranger District to have you put on the mailing list, and then any new decisions that they're looking at making, they'll send you a mailer. They make sure you're notified. And so this is a little bit outside my scope as far as how we get all the information out to the public. I know there's some emailing lists, things like that. We do use technology quite a bit to try to help get the word out. But also, we typically have a lot of public meetings ahead of time, especially based on the comments we think we're going to receive. So if it's more of a controversial topic, something that we expect a lot of folks out for, we'll have several meetings. Typically, prescribed fire is fairly well accepted. The act of it, the smoke's a little less desirable, obviously. So we don't get a huge turnout, but we have a public meeting for every decision we make on the forest.
So, on the NEPA, of course, sometimes that NEPA study takes forever and is blamed for a lot of different problems in the forest or other areas. So how long does it take to go through a NEPA study for a prescribed burn? Because again, NEPA can take a long time.
Right.
So are you looking at these years out to get that study, or are they done fairly quickly?
I'd probably have to give you an average. It depends. There's different categories of NEPA, which really isn't going to bias a lot on this show. But very simple decisions can get out in just a few months, 3 to 6 months. Obviously, depending on whether or not each decision has an objection period, an appeal period, and so those have Congress's set, timelines for those. That can't be mitigated, shortened, anything like that. So, but typically a project that doesn't receive a lot of objections isn't going to have an appeal. I would say on a fairly large landscape type decision, let's say 10 to 15,000 acres of prescribed burning, something like that, you're looking at 18 months, maybe a year.
So a lot of planning.
So quite a bit of planning, and we want to put our best foot forward, obviously, and we want the public's buy-in from the get-go if we can get it. And so it's in our best interest to get the communities involved from the onset, and so we spend some time on that.
So you're a year and a half out looking for a controlled burn over here. A lot of things can happen in a year and a half. What happens if things change and you've already got the approval? Can you back out of that burn then? In other words, you're going, okay, we want a controlled burn or a prescribed burn over in this area, and you're looking at that a year and a half on the other side to get that approval. But then a lot of things change.
Right. So I think that we used to plan pretty small. When I first started with the agency 20 years ago, we did a lot of smaller scale planning, 1,000 acres, 3,000 acres. That sounds like a lot, but when you look at a watershed or the landscape in general, that's really not that much country.
Right.
So you'll see that we do much larger planning efforts. They take longer, but when we're all said and done, you'll have like the Rodeo Chetasky decision that was signed in 2012. That NEPA documents a couple 100,000 acres, pretty close to that. And so once that NEPA document's signed, as long as, a new species doesn't get listed, there isn't a significant change. We can work under that decision. And so we have a large time frame, essentially, to implement prescribed fire.
Okay.
Let's move from prescribed fire to fire season, which I think we're in the start of, if not already past it. What do you do to prepare every year for the fire season that we know comes up in the spring with the wind until our monsoons hit?
Okay, sure, I can definitely talk to that. So we have several steps we take. Really, fire season in the Southwest anymore doesn't necessarily end. We have small fires year-round, it seems like, even when there's snow on the ground. We still got guys and gals going out and checking little fires here and there. And so you'd posed the question earlier before we started, how many small fires had we had? And we've had quite a few. I don't know the exact number. I probably should have looked that up before I came to meet with you. But, we have several fires, obviously. So for right now, we hire a seasonal workforce. Big movement for us in the spring, April typically, is that seasonal workforce is starting. So our engine crews, our hotshot crews, our helitack crew, they're all in what they do critical training first part of April. And so a lot of them started yesterday. And today's Monday. So a lot of them started yesterday. They'll go through their critical training, get their refreshers done. We'll have engine crews, by midweek this week, staffing all our engines fully. We start looking at schedules as things dry out. We'll go to 7-day staffing where we have a certain number of engines, dozers, hotshot crews staffed every day. We have several preseason meetings, obviously, not only with our partners, but internally as well. We started the restrictions call with the White Mountain Zone, which is the area zone here. It involved several agencies last week to start talking about fire restrictions, what that looks like. And so, we every year we have what's called a readiness inspection. So we give the crews about a month, and then the chiefs and the force supervisor will go out, visit with these folks, kind of bring some key messages from leadership at the national level back to the ground pounders, so to speak. Make sure they know what our intent is as leadership, putting their safety first, obviously, and then we'll do some inspections, some readiness drills, whatever. It's kind of has a different makeup every year, but we'll have the crews run through some different things and just check on if we're ready to go.
So we had a wet fall in summer,
Right?
so there was a lot of growth, and then we started to have a good snowpack, and then it kind of died out on us. But as I drive across the rim, I've noticed that a lot of the grass up there is laying down compared to just standing up, which
Right.
I've always been told is better, at least it's laying down. But there seems to be a lot of a growth, grass and so forth. And then I know that I've heard that, I hear it during fire season, where there's a percentage, or that they talk about the water or the moisture in the logs and so forth.
Okay.
So what, are we have any moisture in our timber up there, or is it?
Okay, so I can speak to that. First, the annual growth that you're talking about, the fine fuels, that's a big deal for us. The Phoenix fire, several weeks ago was primarily moved through the grasses, wind events that you talked about, Brad, in the spring. That's a big carrier. So the fine fuels, a lot of grasses, we've had some really good, robust monsoons the last couple of years, which has been great. It's kind of mitigated the drought, so to speak. We're not in any type of extreme drought, at least here in Arizona anymore. But what that does is it creates a lot of fine fuels. And if we don't get snow to compact that, or those fine fuels remain, and it's never continuous everywhere. It's always a little spotty. There's always going to be areas that have more fine fuels than others, so on and so forth. But yeah, when the snow sits on top of the grass, it compacts it. And basically, if you think about a bunch of matchsticks or a bunch of pine needles, when they're fluffy and the air can kind of move around through them, that sustains combustion. It really helps combustion get going sooner, quicker, burns more intensely. A lot of people burn, wood stoves, and they would get that concept because of this. So when you get the snow that compacts it, then it turns it more into a smoldering type fire where those fuels aren't as available, even given a large wind event. So that's our big catch in the spring is we're getting a lot of storm systems that move to our north, right along the Utah-Colorado border. And so we get a couple of things out of that. We either get a lot of wind, which is typical for our country, but occasionally we get some springtime moisture, as we saw last week, as they're forecasting again this week. So, our predictive services department, they look at what's the next 3 months look like. And they've been pretty solid as far as we're looking at kind of a cooler April, May. But the trick with that is, which will prolong the onset of the severe part of fire season. We're going to have a fire season no matter what. It's just the severity of it. But the trick with that is do we get the moisture or do we just get the wind out of those systems? And that's really variable, and that's the tricky part of their job to nail that down.
So again, the moisture and the logs on the ground and stuff, is it pretty dry or?
Okay, yep, I forgot that. Thanks for taking me back there. So we measure two different types of fuel moistures. We measure a live fuel moisture, which is your trees that are still alive, your brush that's still alive. Depending on the species, some of those are still dormant, even though it's been warm. It's just their growing cycle. They haven't woke up yet. And so they're going to be really low because, in the winter when they're dormant, they send everything to their roots. So the plant on top of the ground that we would measure hasn't started growing yet. But they're a little drier than normal. The juniper trees, the brush that we've had measured, that scale runs, without getting too technical, runs to 300%. That's like fully saturated. So oftentimes in the Southwest, just because we're a drier climate, we're never going to get to 300%. That's like Florida type stuff, swamp type stuff. But we're running right around 100, which is probably about a month ahead of schedule for us. But really because of the drought, the lack of snowfall later in the winter for us, it's not surprising that those fuel moistures are down. The other one that we measure is what we call a fine dead fuel moisture, and we measure those in different size classes. But the big ones that really create severity and intensity in a wildfire are your larger diameter logs that are laying on the ground. So 3 inches plus, 10 inches, 3 to 10 inches. And those typically should be above 20%. We just don't see that anymore, and that's a sign of our drought. You noticed the Lakeside Ranger District was able to implement prescribed fire in December, in the rodeo Chetasky. That kind of should give, that's a long-term drought effect, because really we shouldn't be getting any consumption on those logs in December, right? It should be covered in snow, theoretically, but we were able to implement, in December. So those are all long-term events. Are we a little ahead of schedule as far as drying? Probably, but we had a really warm February, and the winds help with that, so that, that all makes sense. We're not seeing any one factor that's going to lead to critical fire behavior in any one area, and that's all of Arizona and New Mexico.
Okay.
So,
You had talked about a group that meets to, I guess, make some decisions and different things. Can you talk about the group and what they do together?
are you talking about White Mountain restrictions?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, or the White Mountain Zone restrictions. So it's actually a conference call. It's held weekly. That's an effort by the counties, by the Forest Service, by the fire chiefs here in the area. We all get on the call and we just talk about what we've seen over the last week. We typically, the Forest Service will bring some predictive service outputs to the table, to the group, let them know where we're at fire danger wise, what the predictions are for the coming week, the next month, things like that. Just try to bring some science to the discussion. And then each department will talk about how many calls they've run, how many fires they've had, including the Forest Service. If we're seeing large fire activity within our region, which is Arizona, New Mexico, and part of Texas. And we'll just bring that, and it's a collaborative effort because, it's really tough on the public when this entity goes into fire restrictions, but everybody else stays out. And it's really tough on the sheriff's department and our law enforcement folks as far as enforcement there goes. So that's our big effort within the communities, is to all try to be on the same page and try to bring that product back to the public.
When the fire restrictions start to go in effect, which will probably be fairly soon, how do the Forest Service and other members communicate that to the public so they can understand you can have fires in designated campground sites but not in the forest itself, or whatever other restrictions that could be in place?
Okay, so we, social media is obviously a big deal. 311 will put things out. Lots of news releases. You'll hear things on the radio. A lot of times ADOT will work in cooperation with us. We'll put things up on the big electronic billboards that are along 260. That's kind of how we try to get it out.
Then people still ignore it.
So, you're always going to have those folks.
What are the penalties? And do you guys in the Forest Service go out and see if people are building fires where they're not supposed to build fires? And what do you do with them when you catch them?
So we do patrol. Not only do our fire suppression crews get out in the woods and patrol and look for those types of illegal activity, but our law enforcement folks, I don't know the minimum, fine or whatever. I would want law enforcement to speak to that. But obviously the severity of the incident dictates
But you're going to cite them.
the punishment. But I don't know that we're always going to cite. I think it depends on the circumstance. We really want to educate folks. Believe it or not, for us in the mountains, it's second nature. But for whatever reason, there's still those folks that honestly do not know. I don't know how they get from point A to point B and don't realize we're in fire restrictions. But there's still those honest mistakes that happen. For the most part, everybody in the woods, whether they're working or they're there recreating, they're there to do a good job. They have good intentions, and so we try to acknowledge that, and then you have those blatant folks that no matter what you do, no matter how you talk to the public, no matter how much collaboration we have between Navajo, Apache County, the Forest Service, the fire departments, they're going to break the rules because they're going to break the rules.
Right.
Well, Jeremy, we're out of time. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on this month's edition of Shooting Straight with Brad and Casey.